Thank you all for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here. Okay, so a little bit about the series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts and we'll run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar ending. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen. There is no cost. You can find the PowerPoint on their SlideShare using your LinkedIn credentials to log in. Again, there is no cost. We also offer sponsorship opportunities. If you're interested, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now, how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there is no bulk registration. You must register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links. Also, the recording links will be posted here upon completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020 as well, so if you're eager to get a jump start, please find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section, the FAR 2020. Because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have been changed and been updated. Please use this as a reference tool only. And now a little bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. Some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. Okay, and those were our services for federal contractors. We also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorships to in-person events. Please email us and ask for our media kit. Please join us and our friends at the Michigan Apex Accelerator next month on Thursday, March 28th, as we delve into the GSA schedule basics. This webinar is also complimentary and can be found on our website under the events section. Is your business pursuing the Homeland Security contract vehicle and need a compliance matrix or full proposal support? We offer assistance with a DHS PACS contract. Please email us for a quote at hello@jenniferschaus.com. We can also support your business with proposal help on the upcoming NASA SOUP contract. Again, we offer anything from compliance matrix to full handholding and proposal support. hello@jenniferschaus.com is the email to use to contact us for help. Please join us on March 12th for a webinar from the team at the Federal Forecasting app. They will discuss and demo how the app allows users to engage and build relationships, including teaming partners and more. Again, this is recorded and complimentary. Please join us on March 14th at noon for a complimentary webinar with our friends at Agile ATS. If you're looking for recruiting and hiring best practices, strategies, and tactics, please be sure to tune into this lively discussion. Agile ATS provides government contractors with a software platform for hiring and more. Again, this is recorded and complimentary. MyGovWatch has recently conducted some research with government buyers. They will share the results of these findings with us on March 26th in a complimentary webinar. MyGovWatch will debunk the myths about RFIs, RFQs, and RFPs so you can find out what's really going on behind the scenes. Again, the webinar is recorded and complimentary. A little later in June, we'll hear from Carrie Palmatier on small business innovation in federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie will cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These two options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector. This is a two-part series. As always, these are recorded and complimentary. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600 plus webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, Hub Zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars. We want to thank them for posting our events and webinars to their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to establish government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for their live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with contracting peers, learn about upcoming events, opportunities, and also contribute to future programming. The meetings take place on the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on Tuesday, February 27th. Please contact Alicia Fields if you have questions about the meeting. Alicia's email is at the bottom of your screen. Do you want help winning government contracts? Bidspeed can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. Bidspeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G, Empower to Grow. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides a full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market. All in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free. It goes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, now let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Joshua Duvall to the webinar. Josh, we're honored to have you with us today and are excited to hear your presentation on the FAR. We appreciate the time you took to put together the content. Josh, I'll put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide and I'll advance them as we discussed.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. My name is Joshua Duvall. I'm a partner at the DC office of Maynard Nexon, and I'm a government contracts attorney, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about FAR Part 7, which ostensibly covers acquisition plans and several other items that I think are relevant in today's market. If you could go 2 slides, please. Just a quick introduction and disclaimer here. There's a lot more slides that I'm going to talk about today. There's a lot of nuance to FAR Part 7, so I'm not going to really get into everything. But we're going to cover the general procedures, written act plans at a high level, and talk a little bit about bundling and substantial bundling. If you could go to the next slide. And the next one. Okay, so there's that quick intro. Obviously, I'm not here to dispense legal advice on a particular matter, but if you do need one, please consult with an attorney. So let's just dive right in. If we can go to the next slide here. FAR Part 7 generally ensures that agencies are conducting acquisitions in a timely manner. Acquisition planning, as I'll get into, is relatively flexible under the FAR, although the FAR contemplates lots of many pages for FAR Part 7, so to speak. The regulation is written in a way that does confer agency officials with some discretion with how they are to go about doing these acquisition plans, which is nice given the time involved it takes to produce this material and as part of the acquisition process. If we can go to the next slide real quickly, I've just got a definition here. When we talk about acquisition is the acquiring of a contract with appropriated funds for supplies or services, including construction. And critically, if you look at the very middle sentence, it says acquisition begins at the point when the agency needs are established, right? So when the agency is conducting acquisitions, you're going to the genesis point. What do we need and what do we need to do it? Some of these acquisition plans take time to put in place, which is sort of notorious for the federal contracting community. One of the things that the drafters of the OTA statute sought to avoid was this lengthy process. Now, other transactions aren't, the authority doesn't require agencies to follow the FAR, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some sort of planning involved in those. But all of this stuff that we're talking today is largely dispensed when the agency is using its OTA authority. So if we can go to the next slide. So what are we looking at here from a policy perspective? Agencies are required to perform acquisition planning and market research for 4 principal areas. One is commercial item needs, right? So now we've got commercial products and commercial services. I use commercial items here, but for purposes of the FAR, we're talking about commercial products and commercial services. 2, full and open competition. So we've got, the 7 exceptions to full and open competition under FAR Part 6. 1, responsible source, for example, or unusual and compelling urgency, among other things. So the agencies are using the acquisition plan to determine whether or not the requirements can be met through full and open, or if they can be sole sourced ostensibly. The other thing that acquisition plans are used for is to help determine the appropriate contract type. So if you look at FAR Part 16, we've got fixed price contracts, we've got fixed price incentive fee, we've got cost reimbursable, we have all kinds of time and materials, labor hours. So there's a lot of different ways that the government can acquire goods and services from the contracting public. And so during this acquisition plan, part of the analysis that the agencies are going to be undertaking is to determine, what type of contract they anticipate using for that particular procurement, and also the appropriate use of existing contracts. So anytime that the agency can use a pre-existing contracts or interagency or intra-agency contracts to fulfill the requirement under FAR 802 and 804 before awarding a new contract, the acquisition plan is designed to facilitate that process. Now, critically, as I mentioned before, in the policy section, it does provide the latitude I was talking about before. The planning activities are supposed to integrate the entire, nucleus of personnel responsible for the significant aspects of the proposed acquisition, so that the government can meet its needs in the most effective, economical, and timely manner, right? So the draw is, if we're conducting acquisition planning in an appropriate way, we're not going to be hit with potential protests, for example, where a commercial company comes in and says, "Hey, wait a second, you're procuring a solution that there are commercial products for. What gives?" And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But critically here, if we look at 7102B, it does say that the agencies that have a detailed acquisition plan in place that generally meets the requirements of 7104 and 7105 isn't going to have to revise those acquisition plans in order to meet the requirements, right? So that's the flexibility that I was talking about. And 7104 and 7105 are fairly robust. So, I think the drafters of the FAR are thinking forward thinking that although this is a sometimes quite tedious process, an agency is not going to be found to have violated its obligation here if it's not exactly checking every box that's in the FAR. So if we can go to the next slide. So what are the agency head responsibilities? If you look in the FAR, there's 26, A through Y here. And, this is sort of going back to the policy. The agency or designee is required to prescribe procedures for promoting full and open competition, for example, encouraging the commercial products and commercial services, for ensuring that the statement of work are closely aligned with performance outcomes and cost estimates, right? So this is all being built in on the front end so that there are real no surprises come competition if it's full and open, for example. There's a whole universe of requirements here. I don't want to dive into all of them, but there are several that are worth exploring. One of them is under subsection U, which is ensuring that acquisition planners, to the maximum extent practicable, structure the contract requirements to facilitate competition by and among small business concerns. So this is where we're talking about, thinking of, whether or not small business concerns can be utilized at the prime contract level to fulfill the agency's needs, which I think is critical in this time because there's a lot of work out there that I believe that can rightfully fit within the competition by and among small businesses. And so by doing this on the front end, the agency is also not, being at risk for SBA wondering why the goaling under the Small Business Act aren't being met. So if we can go to the next slide, this is some more of what I was talking about here. Principally ensuring that there's knowledge transfer happening during the acquisition planning process. So each acquisition isn't necessarily starting afresh. If we've got a follow-on procurement that's having some minor updates for depending on the agency's needs, you're not always going back and trying to reinvent the wheel here, right? So that again shows that the drafters here are thinking about this flexibility with conducting these acquisition plans. So if we can go to the next slide here. So now we're getting into the general procedures. FAR 7104 are the general procedures, and FAR 7105 are the contents of the acquisition plans. And as I mentioned a couple slides back, under the policy, the agency, the FAR makes it clear that as long as you're adhering to what's in here, you're not going to be found to have violated the mandate that you conduct this acquisition planning by not doing everything in here, right? But as I mentioned, under the definition, acquisition planning should begin as soon as the agency needs are identified. The planner is required to coordinate, for example, and secure the concurrence of the contracting officer in the acquisition planning. And in addition, the contracting planner or the acquisition planner is required to coordinate the acquisition strategy with the cognizant small business specialist, because this goes back to making sure that small businesses are utilized to the maximum extent practicable, as well as being being mindful of whether contract requirements have been bundled. And so we'll get into bundling a little bit later, but that's ostensibly a situation where you've got 5 or 6 contracts that are going to be gobbled up under one new contract, and where those requirements, could previously be met by small business concerns. The issue with bundling is that, by putting all those under one contract vehicle or one contract, the small businesses will not be able to, basically bid on that work as a prime contract. So if we advance the slide, this is the contents of the written act plan. As I mentioned, not everything here is going to be required to be hit for the agency to have met its burden underneath the under the FAR, but it principally discusses 22 separate. Well, in the act plan of action, you've got 22 items, but here we've got under acquisition background and objectives. I think I've put a couple up here. There's eight items in the FAR. Establishing cost goals. How is the agency going to meet its technical, business, and management. It's going to discuss technical cost and schedule risks. All these things that are being thought of at the forefront prior to commencing competition are going to help ensure that there is successful contract performance on the back end, right? So if the agency truly doesn't think that small businesses can do the work, part of their analysis may be that they don't think that there's going to be schedule or performance risks, with a large business, whereas those may be present with a small business, and so that would lead them to a determination to put it to full and open rather than to setting the procurement aside for competition and buying among small businesses. If we go to the plan of action, which is the next slide, or this slide, right, rather, we've got 22 elements that the FAR contemplates, right? So we've got contract type selection, for example, the source selection procedures. This plan of action is supposed to discuss the source selection procedures for the acquisition, including the timing for submission and evaluating proposals, budgeting and funding considerations, whether contractor versus government performance in some aspects, test and evaluation considerations, environmental and energy conservation objectives, to name a few. Also, contract administration is among these. The government wants to be thinking about how the contract's going to be administered before they even award the contract, right? And so part of the acquisition plan, as I mentioned, is this flexibility. So not all of this is necessarily going to be in the plan, notwithstanding the fact that agencies are encouraged to utilize prior work product. Basically, if you've got a follow-on procurement, for example, and you're making some minor tweaks, you're endeavoring on this acquisition planning process not from a blank canvas. And so that makes it a little bit easier for the folks that are charged with doing this important work, because if that weren't flexible and agencies weren't required to leverage prior expertise, then the procurement timeline would probably be even longer than it is, and it's already quite a quite lengthy timeline. So if we can go to the next slide, this is just a picture that I think sort of helps to encapsulate. One more slide, please. There we go. So this photo, I think, I believe I got it from DAU. It provides a really good sort of picture of what we're talking about for service acquisition lifecycle. So if you're looking at solicitation, for example, that's all the way in step 6, right? That's the solicitation, source selection, award decision, right? When we're talking about acquisition planning, we're going all the way back to step 1. We've got the vision statement, the team charter. Step 2, you're developing the requirements. The government's interviewing stakeholders. They're doing their risk analysis, right? Your market research. So folks that are, I think a lot of the business development folks sort of, discuss, the timing of government procurement, and that, you don't want to be caught by surprise by solicitation, because a lot of the business development efforts are taking prior to the solicitation coming down on SAM.gov, or what used to be FBO, because there's a lot of work that's put in place by a number of people to get to a solicitation, right? So I think this one, and I also, if you go to the next slide, I think these two are really good, pictures that sort of encapsulate the process here, right? We've got plan, develop, and execute. I think, what folks that are sort of new to acquisition planning may not be aware that to the extent to which there's a lot of moving parts behind the scenes, right? So this sort of, I think, encapsulates that. Prior to sort of going to the next slide, I think it bears mentioning. I discussed earlier, acquisition planning for full and open competition, or whether or not an agency could or should set aside the competition or whether or not the agency can utilize sole sourcing under FAR 6302. The other thing that I discussed was this concept of commercial products and commercial services, right? And so there was a case a couple of years ago that was at the federal United States Court of it made it all the way up to the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. It was at the Court of Federal Claims prior to that. And that was a situation where a commercial company, Palantir, challenged in a pre-award bid protest an Army solicitation for its distributed common ground system, alleging, among other things, that the agency failed to determine whether its needs could be met through commercial items instead of sort of procuring this product afresh. And at the time, Palantir had been providing its service to multiple military and intelligence community customers, so it wasn't a product that was unknown at the time. But when the procurement came out, they were sort of miffed by the fact that the agency was going to be, or the Army was going to be, seeking a contractor to build the thing that Palantir alleged in its protest, that it was already not only had built but was in use, right? And so the court ultimately found in favor of Palantir that the agency failed to conduct its proper market research, among other things, which it goes back to the acquisition planning process, right? So here you've got a situation where the agency has done extensive acquisition planning. It's aware of and has been made aware of this type of solution. It even, in their acquisition plan, I believe they even recognized that there was a potential for a hybrid approach utilizing both commercial item, commercial product with sort of a new buy to build type of situation, but the planners sort of cast that aside for a wholly new product to be built with government funds. And when we talk about this all goes back to the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 94, FASA, which says that the government's supposed to be procuring these commercial items to the maximum extent practicable, right? And so it seems like every couple years we see more and more commercial item procurement protests, because a lot of the folks that are coming out of Silicon Valley, as well as other areas in the U.S., are building these needs that are now sort of commercialized to the point where the government can really leverage these products for, among other things, DHS and public safety type issues, as well as for the DoD and intelligence community. So that is, I think, a critical thing to keep in mind when we're talking about acquisition planning and this market research, is that you do have interested players in the space that are watching these acquisitions, and they're trying to find a way to ensure that the government meets the requirement that it does, to the maximum extent practicable, acquire these commercial products and solutions. And so with that sort of out of the way, we're going to go to the next slide now, which is another interesting part of FAR Part 7, which discusses bundling and consolidation. I think I've got a couple slides here on consolidation. If we can go to the next one, the easiest way of phrasing it is that where you've got a separate smaller contracts that are put together, those can be deemed a consolidation, right? And if you can advance to slide 24, I think our audience would benefit from me not reading these slides, which I think they can find on the materials that are presented to them. Go one back, which was the picture. So here we have consolidation and bundled contracts, right? And so this is starting to become, I think, more of an issue. Consolidated contracts and bundled contracts are very similar, because they involved taking smaller separate contracts and putting them together. Bundling is a subset, and small businesses are worried about bundling because if we look to the FAR's definition of bundling, it's a subset of consolidation that combines two or more requirements for supplies or services into a solicitation for a single contract, a MAC or a task or delivery order that is likely to be unsuitable for award to a small business, even if that small business were to use a small business teaming arrangement, which would be a JV or the use of subcontractors, right? And that's principally due because of the size or specialized nature of the work, the dollar value of the anticipated award, the geographical dispersion of contract performance, or any combination of the factors, right? So small businesses are incredibly sensitive to this, given that a lot of the time the government is combining contracts for purposes of efficiency. They're finding new ways to do things. Maybe there's new products or services that are coming to light that would seem to suggest that combining separate contracts into one, whether it's underneath a MAC or otherwise, would be beneficial to the government. And when that happens, the government now has, under the FAR Part 7, some more actions to take, right? And so if we go to the next slide, which sort of echoes what I've just mentioned here, the bundling may provide the government with substantial benefits, right? But because the impact to small businesses, namely that there's going to be a very hard chance for that small business to compete as a prime contractor, the government's needs to basically justify the bundling to a degree that satisfies the requirements under FAR Part 7. So if we can advance the slide, right? So here the government under FAR 71073 tells the agency that it's got to quantify these specific benefits. And those benefits may be cost savings, right? You're going to have, by bundling two or more contracts together, you think that it's going to be cheaper for the taxpayer, right, rather than more expensive, right? Your acquisition planners are visioning efficiencies in the process, right? You also are thinking that there's going to be a reduced acquisition cycle. You think there's going to be better terms and conditions, and you also think that there's going to be a quality improvement, right? So these are the things that the FAR requires agencies to do when they're considering these acquisition bundling decisions. Now, the government doesn't always follow these, and which is where the protest mechanism comes into play. But there are other times, which I believe there was one or 2 years ago, where the civilian agency posted to sam.gov its intention of consolidating about 10 small business contracts together, right? And so there they, basically went down the list of explaining why that they were going to do this. And at the time, it was largely cost savings, and they thought there'd be quality improvements and more efficiencies gained by such approach. But the folks that were bidding on the incumbent efforts were probably not enthusiastic to learn that what was a contract that they could perform by themselves was going to be looped into a bundled effort where it would be a little bit more difficult for them to bid as a prime contractor. And now if we go to the next slide, the FAR next says that the benefits are measurably substantial if the agency anticipates benefits of 10% of the contract or more if the value is above 94, if the contract's under 94 million, or 5% if the contract's above 94 million. So the government, the FAR puts some guardrails here in terms of where it thinks the dollar value meets the measurably substantial benefit. If we can go to the next slide. Here we see substantial bundling. It's a bundling that results in a contract or task or delivery order that exceeds 8 million for DoD. So here we go, you know, when we've got a substantial bundling and these thresholds are triggered, there's going to be additional requirements under 7103 when we're now in 7104. So if we go to the next slide, we've got even more requirements that the government needs to consider, right? So in addition to the requirements of 7103, you know, the agencies shall document the specific benefits to be derived. That's B1. An assessment of the specific impediments to small business participation as a result of the bundling. Actions designed to maximize small business participation. The determination that the anticipated benefits are justify its use, and alternative strategies that would reduce the risk of the bundling, which is, if we go to the next slide. So all of these are to be in mind when the government is considering a substantial bundling, right? Which again is bundling, but over a certain threshold, right? And so this is just making sure that the government is thinking about small business concerns during their acquisition planning process, right? That they're thinking about how it's going to impact that community. You know, it's the problem of moving a contract that was small before, now it's full and open, is not only doesn't serve the government in meeting its contracting goals to small businesses under the Small Business Act, but also could be a situation where the government may be paying more money for the same work, even though it's anticipating some savings. So with that in mind, I think the next sort of part that we need to consider here are the notification. And so when the government's considering the bundling, the government needs to make appropriate notifications, right? This tells and alerts not only the incumbents that are about to have contracts potentially moved into a larger vehicle, that they may not be in a position to compete as a prime contractor the next go around, but also puts other interested folks on notice of the government's intent, right? And so under 7107-5, the contractor's officers got to notify each small business that's performing a contract that it intends to bundle 30 days prior to the issuance of the solicitation. The government needs to put in the government point of entry, which is sam.gov, is encouraged to provide notification of the rationale for bundled requirements, right? If the government is substantially bundling, the agency must also publish in the government point of entry that is determined that a procurement involves substantial bundling, and the solicitation may not be publicized prior to 7 days from that determination. That gives folks time to think about it, ruminate over it, potentially file a protest, figure out, did the agency follow the requirements for substantial bundling under 7107-4 to ensure that, you know, they're not, these small business contracts are not really being adversely impacted. So here we've got, as I mentioned, notifications. There are some time limits and specific personnel that need to be notified. I put them on this slide and on the next slide. Here we've got, sorry, my computer just froze. So as I mentioned, the contracting officer is going to notify the small business. It's got to publish a list on the website, the bundled requirement. And if we go to the next slide, for each follow-on or bundled requirement, the contracting officer is going to obtain from the required activity and notify the SBA PCR no later than 30 days prior to the issuance of the solicitation. So this, again, provides the necessary check on the agency's decisions to go ahead with a bundled contract. The SBA is going to be involved. They're going to be aware of what's going on, and they're going to have an opportunity to provide input. Now, I think the last slide that I've got here sort of has a couple other things that I'm not going to go into today. But the FAR does, one more slide, contemplate additional requirements for major systems. FAR subpart 7.2, planning for purchase of supplies and economic quantities. Subpart 7.3 is contractor versus government performance, right? So if we look at inherently governmental functions, that's discussed there. Subpart 7.4, equipment leases or purchases, and FAR subpoint 7.5, which again, inherently governmental functions. This is a pretty lengthy, but I think many of you can sort of guess what's inherently governmental: determining what supplies or services the government is going to acquire, voting on source selection evaluation boards, participating on the evaluation boards, making contracts and administering contracts and terminating contracts, criminal investigations, controlling intelligence and counterintelligence activities, and the like. So all of these inherently governmental functions are placed here in FAR subpart 7.5 as part of the government's acquisition planning activities to make sure that they're not farming out work to companies or individuals, that work which should be retained as inherently governmental. And so to tie a bow on acquisition planning, I think it's important to reiterate that we're really focused on 4 principal areas. Is the government going to utilize commercial items and commercial products and services? Is the government going to conduct a full and open competition or sole source it? Is the government going to do its rule of 2 analysis, which is part of the market research that the agency references in its policy, as to whether or not the procurement is going to be set aside? Is the government going to issue the procurement under a fixed price basis or a cost reimbursable basis, for example? And making these determinations, it's going to move along the acquisition planning timeframe and utilize all of its resources, including pre-existing contract acquisition plans, to sort of come together with a new requirement that hopefully leverages the flexibility permitted under FAR 7102 in following the requirements of 7104 and 7105 to produce an acquisition plan that will enable the government to meet its objective and have a timely and an efficient and an acquisition that is also at a reasonable budget at a number determined by the government. And so with that, I think we're at about 30 minutes. And so I understand that we do not do questions as part of this, but I do want to thank everyone for their attentiveness. FAR Part 7 is lengthy, but again, flexible. And while it contemplates a number of significant actions and milestones for the government to meet during this process, it does contemplate some flexibility. But for those particularly in the small business community who are worried that their contract's going to be gobbled up into a larger contract where you cannot compete, the FAR does have those protections in there, and with the notification procedures, if you should come along one of those bundled procedures, there is a potential recourse, as the same is true for those of you that are in the commercial item, commercial product, commercial service space, and you think the government isn't appropriately leveraging those services. You can do what Palantir did and utilize pre-award protest to challenge the agency's determination as to whether or not the procurement should have been competed with commercial items. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Jennifer Schaus and Associates for the opportunity to present here today. I hope I've provided a little bit of context into FAR Part 7, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Joshua, for a very informative presentation. Thanks again to everyone who joined us today. Also, as mentioned, you can always catch the recording on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. And that's it for today's webinar. Thank you again to our speaker, Joshua Duvall, and everyone who joined us today.